Hello and welcome. My name is Zafar Iqbal and you are watching the Mojo Story. Upping the ante, Russian President Vladimir Putin has declared that his country was suspending its participation in the START Treaty, a nuclear arms control pact with the United States. The new START Treaty caps the number of nuclear warheads that US and Russia can deploy. In his State of the Nation address, Putin said that Russia should stand ready to resume nuclear weapons tests if the US does so. Putin accused the US and its NATO allies of openly declaring the goal of Russia's defeat in Ukraine. He said they want to inflict a strategic defeat on us and try to get to our nuclear facilities at the same time. Earlier, US President Joe Biden took a train to Ukraine and made an unannounced visit to Kyiv, where he said that the US will back Ukraine in its fight against Russia for as long as it takes. Uh, Very significant. To discuss this, we are joined by an eminent panel. We're joined by Dr. Tara Kartha, she's a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. Welcome to the show. We're also joined by Ambassador KP Fabian, as a former diplomat. Bhuvan Bagga also joins us as South Asia correspondent of the AFP, and Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, former DG Infantry, also joins us. If I may start with you, Ambassador KP Fabian, how significant is the decision of Putin to withdraw from the START treaty? You can
Without
unmute,
expanding
sir.
on it, that three men are responsible for starting this war. That is Putin, Biden, and Zelensky. Now, to move on to your question, I agree it is significant, but we should not overstate its significance because Putin has clearly stated that Russia will not start testing unless the United States does, and that he would abide by the limit put on deployed weapons. Moreover, he has explained why he is suspending the cooperation because the New START also provides for sort of an inspection. So he said that, under the circumstances, Americans are not welcome to inspect what Russia is doing. So I think we should see it as a measured reaction. And I have seen newspaper reports saying that he has even threatened the use of nuclear weapons. No, this is all bad, wrong reporting and part of the demonization of Putin. That is a cottage industry very active.
Right. Measured reaction and demonization of Putin. Dr. Tara Kartha, what do you have to say?
I wouldn't take it so lightly because any treaty like this is, let's remember, this is the last treaty, worthwhile treaty, which is still in existence. The other treaties have all been abandoned mainly by the US. They abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. They abandoned the INF treaty. They abandoned the Open Skies treaty. The last remaining treaty, which kind of limits this humongous number of nuclear weapons, is this. And let's also remember that earlier treaties went the same way. They went in by suspending, and then the treaty went out of the door. So I agree with the ambassador that one hopes that this is a measure of Putin trying to negotiate with the US, trying to negotiate an end to the war. But the thing is, as it stands now, it is extremely dangerous because if you can't, remember, there are forces on both sides who want to go and weaponize more, add more sort of, new weaponry into the arsenal, for example, in terms of, hyper velocity, all of that. So if the numbers rise, think how China and the other countries are going to take this. If this treaty is going to collapse, it will cause another round of arms racing.
Right. Bhuvan Bagga, would you agree that it's a tactic to negotiate on the war by Putin?
I think President Putin's announcement, of course, it's significant because of its symbolism. I mean, but also another issue here is that the position he is in, he doesn't really have a lot of options. So he did not really have a lot of options. So it is one of the few cards he was left with, and he's played that card that we are going to withdraw from the treaty because on ground, the kind of kind of progress that they expected or the Russian forces expected on the ground, that's not really happened. They are still suffering from the same issues in terms of their supply lines or feeding the army and also recruitment and training. So those issues are still there. So in that sense, in terms of the symbolism of it, it's important, and also the kind of messaging it sends, and ultimately the way out, if it whether it happens now or a few months down the line, would ultimately be on the negotiations or negotiating table. So that's what it could be seen as one of those call outs or announcements by the Russian president to see that you could get the other side on the negotiating table sometime soon.
Right. Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, 1 year of war with Ukraine. What is the end game for Putin? At least he is the one who started this war.
Safa, thank you. It's very easy to blame anybody, whether Putin started. If you ask Putin, he'll say, well, he was forced and instigated by the Western powers to do what he has done, because the NATO expansion, much that he wanted, that all nations which have joined NATO after 1997 should not have been there. And that is where the whole thing starts from. But if you look at it, this probably the script had been written long back. When was the European Union formed? 1993. You see NATO, 1949. NATO remains 6 for a long, long time till they become almost 16, or rather 12 as the founding members, and they become 16 till about 1980, till Spain joined. And again, the spurt from 1999, you find from 16 to 30 members of the NATO. So all this has obviously, and more than anything else, probably Poland and Hungary didn't matter much to Putin, as much as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We are part of the Soviet Union, which went and joined. So that obviously irked Putin. And even if you look at it, the Warsaw Pact it was not there. Much that promises had been made to Gorbachev by Reagan then. The promises not been kept. The desire of Russia to be where it used to be as part when it was the Soviet Union. All these little factors. Then what happened in 2014, and your Crimea falling, you see Georgia, you see Chechnya, a lot of these things happening. And the West probably I feel, wanting Russia to be virtually losing its identity. It's not possible. You find even in the British Empire, they're always scared of the Russians wanting to come on to India. And therefore, they need to have all what we have, Afghanistan, Jammu and Kashmir, and all of everything. Subsequently, also, you find the same kind of problems again. I personally would feel that Russia gave a lot of indications of not to start, and 2014 was indicated when they were not a member of the G8, it became G7. Subsequently, you see in 2021, his long speech and his long essays of wanting to say something very, very clearly. I think the Russians were also pushed, and rightly so. The Russians retaliated. The Americans also wanting to test and using Ukraine as a pawn, because Ukraine by itself does not have much. Of course, as Ukraine as an independent country had a lots of it. But today, with the way it has been destroyed totally, I think Ukraine has lost its identity. Ukraine remains nothing but a pawn in the hands of the Western world. And Russia is now fighting not just Ukrainian manpower, but a sizable amount of the military support that comes from there. $100 billion. Can you imagine what is $100 billion aid? And can you imagine the lives lost? Russia lost only 15,000 people in 10 years in Afghanistan. They've lost over 1 lakh people already. So that's a huge amount of loss. And who would want to do it? But where it is, Russia wants its identity. Russia wants that it should be seen as a power to reckon with. And America obviously sees Russia a threat and wants to eradicate it. So that's where the whole thing lies.
In the circumstances that forced Putin to join the war, says General Sanjay Kulkarni, Ambassador Fabian, whatever be the circumstances, but at the moment he's a key player to end the war. He can do it if he wants to.
I don't think so. Before that, I want to draw a parallel between 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and 2022. The basic difference is that generation had the diplomatic maturity to negotiate and find a resolution without a war. And there, as you know, there was a risk of nuclear war. Now, in this case, even if Putin wants to end the war, Zelenskyy has said that he won't talk to Putin. And Biden also has made it very clear that his ultimate aim is to sort of destabilize Russia and, if possible, topple Putin. And so I don't think we can see any end. And it will not be correct to say that if Putin wants, he can stop the war, as Biden and the Europeans have been saying. They are being disingenuous.
Okay. Dr. Tara Kartha, Putin has remained in power for more than 20 years. But is this the war that will finally, define his legacy in the end? This is a very crucial time of his rule.
He will it define this legacy? Certainly. This is what shall I say? It is one of those events that happen hopefully once in a lifetime. This is no small thing, right? The virtual elimination of entire cities, this war which is going on, the number dead. But it's also to do with, from what his speech, at least going by what he said in his speech, he's defined it around Russian identity, around the Russian-Ukrainian, the joint, what they feel together as a people, what they have been as a people together. So that is something which is very firmly rooted in their consciousness. I remember there used to be a Russian restaurant in Washington. That was Russian and Ukrainian food being served together. That was what it was. That's how they were once, right? And that is what it is now. You're seeing they're trying to tear apart into 10 pieces. And having said that, I think you should also, there's a lot of talk of Zelenskyy as this, hero and all that stuff. Of course he is. But there is also the other side of Zelenskyy as a person who has completely cut down on the media. He stopped, I think, about 11 TV channels. He's got, the main opposition parties under control. So he's doing a lot of things which make him look more and more like what the Russians do rather than NATO. So it's all a kind of a shifting identity, if you'd like to call it that.
Right. Bhuvan Bagga, even if Putin wants to, he cannot end the war now. He's caught in a situation that Zelensky says he's not really willing to talk to him. Do you think that that's the situation now?
Given the situation right now, given the condition right now, both the sides, I'm talking about Russia and Ukraine, both sides won't get to the negotiating table now because both the sides feel that there is more that they can achieve or there is more that they can get. And going to the negotiating table now after the public statements and the rhetoric, it would be kind of they would be giving up their face, or they would be giving up their kind of own pride, so to say, to come to a negotiating table. So I see that not happening, at least not immediately, and especially after President Biden's visit. Especially after President Biden's visit, because what it was ultimately was a symbolic messaging from the US to Ukraine, of course, to Russia, and generally speaking to wider Europe and its allies, that yes, we are going to be here, that we are here to back them for as long as it takes. Contrary to some suggestions or some commentaries in the last few weeks that the resolve in the US or in Washington is kind of weakening. But several, European countries would still look at it with some skepticism in terms of US backing for this entire thing. This is a counter argument that could be looked at, is because of US elections that are coming. There is a section of the Republican Party that's vocal against the kind of investments US is making in Ukraine. You look at former President Donald Trump, his statements in the last day or so about the efforts that should instead be. He's talked about war machine in US. Not exactly these words, but essentially talked about that there is a military industrial complex that kind of pushes this entire thing, and it is in their favor that the war kind of goes on longer. And then there is another presidential hopeful in the US, Nikki Haley. She's also talked about on similar lines. So I think a lot could depend on how the US elections go. But for now, Biden has been able to give out a good message that symbolically, visually was on ground.
Biden's message, you raised a very significant point here. Let's play that soundbite, what Biden had to say after he visited Ukraine.
When President Putin ordered his tanks to roll into Ukraine, he thought we would roll over He was wrong. The Ukrainian people are too brave. America, Europe, a coalition of nations from the Atlantic to the Pacific, we were too unified. Democracy was too strong.
Tough words by Biden. The messaging is important. Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni.
I think the message the American president gave was very clear. He says Kyiv is strong, Ukraine is strong, the democracy is strong. If that be so, of course, they all stand by. I think there must be something much more to what the visit would have been all about. There were talks that probably the ceasefire could come through with Russia retaining the eastern and the southern provinces and Ukrainian going for it. But then now a time has reached now, even though the European Union depended on a huge amount of gas coming from Russia, but they have now enough reserves to last about a year or so. So you find countries like Germany, France, Italy, even countries like Poland are not totally dependent. They have enough reserves. They're bought from all over, and that is where they're allowing them that leverage to be able to drag in Russia and probably make, with the sanctions coming on Russia, if they can bankrupt Russia, but it's not possible. The way the Russians are going about it, I think the way even the Russians also have a sizable amount of support, at least from the economic point of view, because the Russian oil is coming to India, Russian oil is going to China, the Iranian oil is coming. So there's a lot which is happening. So the Russians are getting their money and they're sustaining their war. So that's where it lies. I personally feel much that the Americans would want to support Kyiv, and the Kyiv is looking just not, obviously, if you look at it, what is surprising is nations like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania giving almost more than 1% of the GDP as aid to Ukraine. Whereas the Americans, despite having promised about over $100 billion, is just about 0.37% of the GDP. So that's quite a sizable amount of aid coming from countries. So there is a fear of the Russians amongst the countries that are closer to Russia, erstwhile Soviet Union. But all said and done, I think if anybody feels that the Russian identity can be wiped out, I think that's not possible. No winner. In this particular war, there will be no winner. The Ukrainians can forget that they can win. The Russians can forget that they can win. So we have to come to a solution. And the solution still lies that probably the portions which are with Russia, the complete Donbass region, Zaporizhia, we have the Kherson, they have the Crimea, that goes to Russia, because Russia will not, under any circumstance, and what you rightly said, the treaty, 1,550 weapons of all kinds being targeted from air, from ground, from sea. Of course, the treaty is now off. So these kind of weapons, that kind of weaponry, Russia is not on the back foot. Though, of course, the supply lines, the Europeans are also on the back foot. The Americans are also on the back foot. They can't probably, they fire about 24,000 artillery shells per day. There aren't factories enough to manufacture so much ammunition every day. The kind of manufacturing is going on. And China is the winner. China is just side by, is just looking properly and sitting quietly, trying to do nothing very much and ensuring that they can take on Taiwan whenever they want it, or they can probably rule the roost. If Russia wins, so be it. Friendship with Russia will hold on. Russia loses, China wins. And therefore, there are a whole lot of complications. I think it's very difficult, but the fight must end. Otherwise, the world is bound to suffer.
Right. We'll come to the China question in a bit, but Dr. Tara Katha, sanctions against Russia has not worked. The Russian economy has not done so bad as it was thought at the beginning of the war, partly because it's been able to sell the oil.
Yeah, it's sanctions. I think it was, what shall I say? It was never meant as a weapon to stop the war. If you remember right at the beginning, it was a weapon to sort of punish Russia, to get, it was never, nobody ever thought it will stop the war. Plus, don't forget, this is a country that could retreat back into Moscow in the dead of winter and still win a war. I mean, you're talking of the World War period. This is not a country you can easily push down. But, what should I say? Having said that, this is, the war is right now, it's static. I mean, the way we can assess it is the front line moving? The front line is not moving, it's static. And like the general correctly said, that both sides are putting enormous amounts of ammunition and all that stuff, all the paraphernalia of war is going in. Russia has not yet committed all its forces. It's committing a part of its forces. It can carry on. If it carries on, who suffers? The whole world, including us. I mean, let's not forget there is a global crisis on. And that is why this thing needs to be stopped. So I'm not I mean, I think Biden is in a position where with elections coming, there's very little he can do. But I think the world, including India, needs to encourage some form of mediation, because this is getting very, very serious as far as our own economy is concerned also. This is not something we can just shrug off.
Okay. Bhuvan Baka, Dr. Tara Kartha saying that the war is static, but do you think that it can expand further? Possibility of China arming Russia, although China has rubbished those statements and said it's in fact the US pumping weapons into the war theater.
I think China gains through this war with Russia's increasing dependence on China. But when it comes to arming, directly arming, Russia, it's a step. It's like going to be a big step for them. So I don't see that happening publicly, at least. And China wouldn't want to be seen like that, especially when there is still a chance that this war could have serious implications for the Russian administration or the Russian state per se, which is already battered economically since the start of the war, and also how this war goes further. I mean, it would also depend on whether America or the European alliance go on to supply them certain long-range weapons, including F-16s that they have talked about. Whether that happens or not, how exactly that plays out, because that will tell us which way this war is going or how much longer this is going to drag on. And when it comes to sanctions, there was a talk about how sanctions were ineffective. Yes, I mean, if you look at the larger picture, not entirely effective, but many businessmen or oligarchs, as they are called, close to Moscow, close to the ruling administration there, they were targeted. I mean, this was in a way a message, a way to send a message to the ruling elites or ruling classes in Moscow that you have to distance yourself or kind of not back the war efforts. But for now, with the commitment and with the public statements that have come out in the last 12 months, this would likely drag on for a few more months before something dramatic or drastic brings people to the negotiating table. And also, US elections play an important role in the entire thing. US elections and how the Washington ruling establishment cannot be seen as going to the Russian pressure, because many have said that Russia is also in a way, or Putin is also in a way playing for time.
Yeah. So the war can drag on for a few months, says Bhuvan Baga. General Sanjay Kulkarni, when the war started, many thought that it will be a short, sharp war. In a matter of few days, Russia will capture Kyiv. But that's not happened. Putin's calculation gone horribly wrong here, or it's a part of a plan.
You're right, Zafar, because if you see, Putin calls it the special military operations. The way he was gathering his troops around, everybody knew the Americans had given adequate indication that the Russians are going to attack Ukraine. There was no denying the fact. But let's not forget, right from 2014, the Russians have been facing tremendous amount of resistance in the Donbas region. That is itself indicated that despite the Crimea being with them, they were not making successes, and Ukraine was not just being supported. Now, from February 24, 2022, Ukraine has been getting support from the West all along. That is how they would be able to sustain and ensure that the Russians could never succeed in the Donbas region. Even now, look at the way they are fighting in Kharkiv, Sumy. Look at the way they are fighting in Mariupol. Look at Odessa. Even in Crimea, they're not feeling very safe. So you find that the Russians definitely know the strength of the Ukrainians, because after all, they're siblings only. They understand each other so very well. The Russians probably at the initial stages didn't want Ukraine to be totally pulverized. They thought that the Ukrainians might see their way and might join in. It's not possible, because the Ukrainians also have an identity. If you talk of the Russian language, only about 20% people in Ukraine speak Russian. Rest of them are all Ukrainian. But even the Russian provinces which speak more Russian, like Kharkiv, is very much in control of the Ukrainians. You find the entire Donbas region, it's street fighting going on. So this street fighting which is going on in the entire eastern belt of Ukraine is, of course, why the street fight? Because natural resources are there. You find Ukraine, whether it is titanium, whether it is uranium, whether it is manganese, iron ore, coal, whether it is millet, whether it is corn, whether it is sunflower oil, or you name a thing. And that's what the Ukrainian economy was all about. $600 billion economy, all in ruins, total ruins. And all of it grown in this eastern and the southern provinces of Ukraine, which is now in the possession of Russia. So even if Ukraine decides to get independence from losing all this, Ukraine is useless. Ukraine will be thoroughly dependent on the West all their lives, and that is why the population was reducing from where about 40 million people. They were drastically reducing about 3 lakhs every year. That is the kind. Ukrainians were deserting Ukraine and leaving, and a highly corrupt society. Ukrainians are deadly people, but a very, very corrupt society. So in this situation, the Ukrainians were on the back foot, and with so much of aid going in, they could have done much better, because the aid was not just coming now, aid's been coming to them. How else can you fight? Can you take on a tank and start fighting on an artillery gun or a howitzer in a night? We take years to understand our weaponry, and they're getting it today and firing it tomorrow. That means now you know that they were being trained for it for a long, long time. NATO has been into it in Ukraine and training their soldiers. The European Union has been giving them aid. So I find that it's very difficult, and it's a catch-22 situation in where the Ukrainians now have to have a very big, they have to just stand up to it, because the West is giving them all of it, none of theirs.
Right.
So what are the Ukrainians going to lose? Only manpower, because they have nothing else to fight. But that's also important. They are also losing lakhs and lakhs of people. So many civilians that sometimes surprises me, Zafar, when you hear 2 dead and 15 dead. So much of shelling going on, so many missiles being fired. Imagine if it was to happen to any other country, it would have finished long back. But I'm surprised the death may be a large number, but the Ukrainians are still holding on, and the Russians are still struggling to take control of Ukraine. I think that is what is the reality all about.
Dr. Tarak Kartha, as General Saab says that, the West may have been supporting Ukraine for a long time, and Ukraine is completely dependent on West now. But on the other side is that it's also a war of narratives. What Putin, in his long speech, touched upon so many things, and America, as usual, Biden talking about democracy. Do you think it's happening on different levels also?
No, I think one of the main features of this war, which to me is not, I won't say astonishing, but is very striking, is the almost complete absence of a Russian narrative. We don't know why Putin did this. Sorry. We don't know, how the decision making went in. I mean, the Americans seem to know exactly when they were going to attack. They said, we know you're going to attack. And in spite of that, Putin goes and attacks. He's a former KGB director, right? And he should have then stopped the operation, knowing that his intel was completely betrayed. He went ahead anyway. So there's a lot of questions here which we don't understand. And I'm glad at least Putin made a speech. We got to know something. Otherwise, all we hear is, how great this is, how great so-and-so is. Having said all that, Zafar, I mean, to be absolutely fair, if Russia was a really powerful, very attractive country with the things that normal people want, then much of Ukraine would have said, listen, let's go with Russia. They haven't, because finally it's Europe which has got the better benefits. Say you and I are on the street. Where would you rather go? You'd rather go to Europe. So it's a betrayal of the Russian system also. While we have sympathy for Russia, let's not forget, it is very, very far from being the ideal state.
Right. Bhuvan Bagga, lastly coming to you, talking about India. India has been maintaining a balancing act so far. Will it be able to do that in the future also? India has been buying oil from Russia, we know. What's going to happen? It may have to take a position.
India doesn't have an option. India has to kind of maintain balance, because ultimately we may be the fastest growing major economy, but we are still a developing country. There are so many challenges that our own population faces when it comes to food. Like about 800 million of our people are on government rations. So there are different issues that our government has to address internally.
But will it be able? No. The point that I'm asking: will it be able to manage that balancing act in the foreseeable future?
I think
given the dragging.
So given the circumstances, I mean, a lot has already happened, and we've managed to somehow keep all parties. Keep ourselves equidistant publicly from all parties and try to maintain an equal thing. Unless something major happens on the war front, in terms of escalation, I don't really see any other option. I mean, it's also about options for a country that is energy dependent, that is dependent on so much that you get from from outside in terms of your supplies for the emerging industry in different sectors. We can't really do much, and also our long-term dependence on Moscow continues. We may be trying to build weapons at home now, but it's not going to change and happen overnight. It's still going to take a couple of 1 or 2 decades at least. So for that country, we'll have to kind of stay in the same mode that we've been for the last 12 months.
Right. Well, on that note, we come to the end of our show. That's all the time that we have for the show. Thanks to all our panelists for joining us, and thanks for watching.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.